Sometimes I'm gaining, then again I'm losing. Sometimes I'm rising, yes sir. Then again I'm falling. Sometimes I'm gaining, then again I'm losing. Sometimes I'm rising, yes sir. Then again I'm falling. Let Jesus work it out. Please, your Father would work it out. Oh, let God work it out. Please, your Father would work it out. Oh, let God work it out. Please, your Father would work it out. Oh, let God work it out. Oh, work it out. You work it out for Mother Teresa. Sometimes I'm gaining, then again I'm losing. Sometimes I'm rising, yes sir. Then again I'm falling. Sometimes I'm gaining, then again I'm losing. Sometimes I'm rising, yes sir. Then again I'm falling. Let Jesus work it out. Please, your Father would work it out. Oh, let God work it out. Please, your Father would work it out. Oh, let God work it out. Please, your Father would work it out. Oh, let God work it out. Oh, work it out. You work it out for Mother Teresa. Sometimes I'm gaining, then again I'm losing. Sometimes I'm rising, yes sir. Then again I'm falling. Sometimes I'm gaining, then again I'm losing. Sometimes I'm rising, yes sir. Then again I'm falling. Let
All right. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. This is David Patrick Harry with Church of the Eternal Logos. And we got a bit of an interesting stream today. We're going to be diving into the Bloody Baron, the Mad Baron, the White God of War. A gentleman, Roman von Ungern-Sternberg, who was a anti-communist, sort of anti-revolutionary fighter, a starch monarchist, and a bit of an enigma of a person. We're going to be kind of covering a little bit of his life and story. Some of you guys may be familiar based on what I saw in the live chat. I was not aware of this gentleman until one of our men's group meetings. Actually, it was back in January. As I said, I had a queue of streams that I wanted to do, but been so busy with the dissertation, haven't had the chance. And so one of the guys at the men's group was talking about Sternberg and was talking about, did you know about this guy who was actually venerated by the Mongols as the reincarnation of Genghis Khan and led sort of hodgepodge military expeditions between Mongols, White Russians, and Cossacks against the Chinese and the Bolsheviks, the Red Army? And I was like, no. So I kind of looked into this guy, and he's very interesting. And I've seen some Orthodox Christians kind of bring him up. But we're going to be highlighting, he's not exactly a Orthodox Christian figure. Like I said, he's kind of an enigma. So what we'll be witnessing today is a German man from Estonia. So he is of German heritage. He spoke fluent German, French, Russian, and Estonian, probably some other languages. Probably learned a little bit of Mongolian during his time there. He essentially ran the capital Urga, the capital city of Mongolia, for a couple of years. Eventually, he was outed by the Red Army, and he dies at the age of 35. And he actually attains the St. George Military Medal, which was the highest medal in the Russian army. And he was a staunch defender of the Romanovs and the Russian monarchy. But was he Christian? Actually, not so much. And so he was vehemently anti-communist, hated communists, and is associated. And I'm going to talk about this. I have a document I put together on one of the more controversial dimensions on Roman von Ungern-Sternberg, and that is his belief of the Jews being tied with communism, and has led him to be considered one of the preeminent anti-Semites of history. But he's an incredibly violent man. We're going to find out and this is why he's such an enigma. He comes from aristocratic, noble lineage, and he is very proud about his aristocratic identity, and yet he despises other nobles. He did terrible in school, got terrible marks within school, but was pretty good in regards to some of the gym class, physical fitness, and had a talent for military extravaganza. What am I trying to say? Military endeavors. And he joined the military, and he's renowned for his heroism, where he was a sociopath. So this guy was incredibly violent, but he would lead his band of brothers, if you will, in battle against military tanks, airplanes, machine guns on just horseback. and there's like a quote that I want to share with you guys at one point. He was so brazen in his fighting pursuits and what he would do on the battlefield that it would actually shock some of the enemies that he was fighting. I mean, literally, there's an instance, and he was injured so many times, where he would just ride a horse and pull out a sword and charge straight towards barbed wire fences and machine guns. But anyways, I thought this guy was a fascinating historical figure. We're going to kind of go over, like I said, his life, his success, his downfall, because one of the things that led to his downfall was the mutiny of his brothers, of the people that supported his rebellion against the Red Army. But he was so brazen and took so many chances and really lost so many of his brothers and fellow soldiers that people began to mutiny and didn't believe, didn't want to follow this guy much further. Incredibly violent. And he apparently had this vision. So getting back to the religion, um, is he Orthodox Christian? Not really. I mean, he grew up in a sort of Orthodox, Russian Orthodox Christian context, was very pro Orthodox Christianity and the monarchy. He believed that the Romanov family was appointed by God to lead Russia, and that the communists and anybody that wanted to overthrow the monarchy were essentially part of an antichrist spirit. Now, he wasn't explicitly Christian. He was very much enamored with Eastern mysticism, Buddhism, shamanism, and he believed that he had a vision at one point of the Buddha himself, who revealed to Roman that he was the reincarnation of Genghis Khan and that he had a spiritual destiny to take over, capture Urga, which he eventually does. I believe it's in 1921 from the Chinese. He takes over Urga, the capital of Mongolia, and planned on doing essentially a conquest of the Red Army of Russia and go all the way back to Europe. Of course, it never came to fulfillment, and his reign in Mongolia was met with a lot of uncertainty and chaos, which typically followed this guy. But he, like, for example, was voluntarily celibate. Apparently, him and some of his compatriots, they were voluntarily celibate, which was based on their sort of spiritual beliefs, but they were sort of famous for their indulgence in alcohol, opium, and hashish. And so you could essentially indulge yourself in alcohol, opium, and hashish as much as you want. And he particularly used opium and hashish and for sort of spiritual purposes to contact these higher realms. And so he was a staunch believer in reincarnation. This is one of the many things that would mark him as not very Christian. Could you label him an Orthodox Christian? Not really, in any sort of systematic theological sense. Was he a staunch defender of the Orthodox Church? Absolutely. Absolutely. And he despised atheism. He despised communism. He despised socialism. And he despised Judaism, which is one of the things that he has kind of got his famous stamp, has been kind of famously stamped on him as a sort of ultimate anti-Semite. So, we're going to, again, my document touches on a lot of different aspects. He's kind of a forgotten figure in history, and he's not incredibly important. Now, one of the interesting things I found in preparation for the stream was kind of looking at how he's viewed by military historians, and it's sort of a mixed bag. In regards to being a heroic figure that was willing to just go out into the line of danger, absolutely, that was this guy. I mean, other people described him as somebody who was pursuing his death. He believed that he was going to die in battle, which actually he didn't. The way that his sort of campaign and life came to an end was due to the mutiny of his soldiers at one point. So the Dalai Lama, for more context, if you're familiar with Mongolia is Vajrayana Buddhist. So there's kind of three big schools or denominations of Buddhism. You have Theravada, the sort of traditionalist school, Mahayana, the greater vehicle, and then you have Vajrayana. And Vajrayana is mostly associated with Tibet and Tibetan Buddhism. But Mongolia actually adopted Vajrayana Buddhism. And so Mongolia is part of this sort of Tibetan Buddhist tradition, and the Dalai Lama. And within Vajrayana, we've talked about this before. I did a whole stream covering Buddhism, an introduction to Buddhism. Vajrayana has tons of deities. So when people say, oh, Buddhism, they don't believe in gods. Well, it depends on what school. If you're talking about Zen Buddhism, yeah, you're absolutely right. If you're talking about Vajrayana Buddhism, no, that's not the case at all. They have tons of deities. And some of these deities are marked as what they would describe as gods of war. And so some of the local Vajrayana Buddhists, there was a prophecy, a belief that was circulating at the time of Romans' conquest that somebody was going to come and liberate them from the Chinese and sort of reestablish the Khanate. and kind of bring Mongolia back to its glory. And this was all part of this sort of Vajrayana Buddhist prophecy and lore. And this is one of the reasons why even the Dalai Lama himself at this point, recognizing Roman and how he overthrew the Chinese. I mean, and he defeated, I forget the exact numbers, but it was in the ballpark of like 1,700 men he had, and it was somewhere between 10 and 20,000 Chinese soldiers who were encamped within the capital city. And he had this, he created this illusion by lighting fires all around the city to make his army look like it was much larger than it actually was. And because of the Buddhist beliefs that a savior, a military political figure was going to come and sort of liberate Mongolia and the Tibetan Buddhists, the locals believed that Roman was this man. And in fact, it caused terror amongst the Chinese who occupied the city, thinking that maybe this prophecy was real. And the fact that he was able to, he eventually rode up on a white horse, again, kind of symbolically filling some of this prophecy. And eventually the Chinese surrendered and he was able to take over the city. And this is why within the Tibetan Buddhist tradition at the beginning of the 20th century, many people, especially the locals, believe that he was the reincarnation of Genghis Khan, and he was this prophesied military leader that was going to lead to total liberation and sort of a redominance of Mongolia. So very, very interesting. But eventually he wanted to, he realized that his time was limited. The Red Army was expanding, and Lenin at one point devoted the entire Red Army to come and find this guy and kill him, because he was such a nuisance in what he was doing and his kind of skirmishes with the Red Army. Well, eventually they did just that. And so Roman von Ungern-Sternberg was unaware that the Romanov family had already been completely killed, and believed that the younger brother Michael would sort of retake the throne as the Russian Tsar. Well, anyways, he was unaware that the Red Army had essentially won the Civil War, and realizing he was about to be encircled, decided that he was going to flee across Mongolia, across the Gobi Desert and parts of China, and go and take refuge in Tibet, where many Tibetan Buddhists believed him to be the reincarnation of the god of war and Genghis Khan. Before they were able to fully embark on that, his soldiers were just fed up with it. They were fed up. He was incredibly violent. He didn't really respect some of his compatriots. They were tired. Again, he was essentially sacrificing some of these men in battle because he was so, I mean, if you want to say a sociopath or brave, he would just, like I said, charge on horseback into tanks, airplanes, and machine guns. Somehow he survived, but many of his Cossack soldiers died. In fact, some of the battles he was a part of, the Cossacks had more deaths, casualties amongst those battles than any other battles during the Russian Revolution. So tremendous loss on the part of Roman von Ungern-Sternberg. And this is why I saw one historian from the U.S. Air Force Academy talk about that you could make the argument he was one of the worst military leaders of all time because of his tactics. And essentially, he was wanting to reestablish sort of medieval monarchical rule wherever he went. And he wanted to essentially be the king or the czar of Mongolia. And that effort essentially failed. And so when his men were mutinied and they were so sort of tired of Roman and everything he was doing, they tied him up to a tree and told the Red Army where he was so that they could capture him. And that's essentially what happened. He was brought back to Moscow, and he actually swallowed his military medals before being executed because, he despised communists so bad. He didn't want a communist finger to touch his military medals, and so he swallowed them before he was executed. And I found one story that was kind of interesting. Apparently he was wearing some type of Mongolian, Tibetan Buddhist, shamanic medallion is what he had around his neck when he was taken by the Red Army. And they allowed him to wear it when he was put before the firing squad. And apparently one bullet actually hit his medallion and severely wounded one of the Red Army soldiers. So that's kind of part of the legend of the Mad Baron, that even when he was being killed, he still somehow was able to harm the enemy. So we're going to be covering this guy's life. I got a couple YouTube videos. I put a document together, and I got this great article called The Ghost of Genghis Khan, which we're going to be covering. So that's kind of the topic today. Unusual topic. I found a couple of documentaries online on this guy. They're all right. They're kind of boring. I didn't want to show you guys. So what we're going to be doing is I found one video that kind of gives a narrative overview, and then another video that really talks about some of his military endeavors. And so we're going to be covering those. And then I got a whole section on his religious beliefs, the timeline of his life, and his thoughts about Jews, and one of the reasons why he is labeled the way that he is labeled. So we're going to get on all that. So smash that like, guys. Thank you all for being here. If you'd like to support the stream, please send in a super chat using Streamlabs or Dono Chat, or YouTube if you prefer to use YouTube. And if we have anybody feeling generous today, please send in some COTEL Crew memberships for the live chat. That's always greatly appreciated. Jaden Day throws in 5, says, dude, I actually love to hear about this guy in history. He's just so interesting. Reincarnation of Genghis Khan and the Buddhist god of death. Crazy. Yeah, and that's why I wanted to cover it today. I mean, one, a lot of people have never heard of this guy. I brought him up in the fitness group we had on the website last night, and nobody was familiar with him. But it's fascinating. I mean, again, the enigma, a German who was Estonian, so grew up in Estonia, had his heritage with the Teutonic Knights and all this different stuff, was a devout Russian monarchist, like to the bone. I mean, he was the ultimate Russian nationalist, and yet the dude wasn't even Slavic. He couldn't abide by any rules. He was kicked out of school. He was kicked out of military academies. This dude only thrived legitimately in battle. Like, that's what this dude wanted. And he was successful, and his bravery was renowned by his soldiers. But he's a defender of the Orthodox Church and the Russian monarchy, gives up his Russian Orthodoxy, believes that the Buddha personally came to him in some type of mystical vision he had. Could have been on opium, could have been under hashish. We're not totally sure. We do know that he was using those substances for quote-unquote spiritual practices. Loved Eastern mysticism, loved even Mongolian shamanism, which even Vajrayana Buddhism is a sort of mixture of Bon. Bon is the tribal group in Tibet, B-O-N, and they were a shamanic group. So Vajrayana Buddhism, part of the reason why it's believed they have so many deities is that particular school of Buddhism is mixed with a sort of traditional shamanism of the Bon people. But he loved shamanism. He loved magic. He loved mysticism, and he hated atheism. But was he Christian? No, not really. Was he Orthodox? No, not really. Would he die in defense of the Russian Orthodox? Yeah, he would. Again, very weird kind of circumstance. And yeah, so I think today it's an interesting topic, whether you guys know about it or not, but worthy discussing and just bringing it to people's attention. So I don't plan on this being a super long stream like some of the other ones. I want to do more topics like this where I just kind of bring something up and maybe create only about an hour and a half worth of content, and just leave space open for discussion. You guys send in questions, comments, what you thoughts, maybe things that you know about the Mad Baron, the God of War, that maybe I'm no expert on this. So certainly you guys probably know some things that I don't know. I'm just trying to give a sort of introduction and quick overview of this guy because it's worth knowing about. So thank you so much, Jaden. Really appreciate that support. And let me check if anybody sent in anything on the Dono Chat or Streamlabs. So guys, please support the work and send in comments, questions, anything regarding today's topic. I want to do some quick housekeeping, and I want to let you guys know that if you're interested in getting a cookbook for the Lenten season on how you can maintain your gains, get high protein meals, I've partnered with Seraphim. He's one of the Orthodox brothers down at Father Moses's church, And he has a really good book called Orthodox Fasting, a cookbook for strength and performance. And if you use this link right here, guys, this Gumroad link that I'm sharing in the chat, you guys can purchase his book. It's great for Lent. It's great for recipes and finding meals in which you can actually get high protein quality food, and you can maintain your gains during the Lenten season and maintain the fast totally. So check out that. Also, if you guys would like to support my work, one of the best things you could do is go to my website and become a website member. We just had a fitness meeting for April last night. So our first fitness meeting, and we have next Wednesday will be the second Premium Logos meeting for the month of April. So if you guys would like to be a part of that, please sign up. We would love to have you and greatly appreciate it. And then if you want to get access, for example, like today's show notes, those are for $5 a month. You get access to all my exclusive video content and all the show notes that I put together. Those are available for $5 a month. Also, if anybody would like to sign up for a one-on-one session, you can do so with this link right here. Would greatly appreciate that. We can get into a private Zoom meeting and discuss anything your heart desires. And then also, if you want to sponsor a stream, today's stream is not sponsored. Today's stream was a stream I wanted to do, like I said, a couple months ago, but haven't had the opportunity to dive in and kind of prepare and do some of the research. And so we're doing it now. And if you have a topic you would like to sponsor, please do so with this link right here. We got a handful. We got about 5 sponsored streams lined up. So if you do sponsor a stream, realize it's going to be a couple weeks before we get to it. But we got tons of sponsored streams coming. And if you have a good topic, please sign up. We'd be greatly appreciative for the support. And I will do the due diligence of the research and perform that. So thank you guys very much for that. And then last final thing, if you guys are in the market for Orthodox items, could be prayer ropes, incense lamps, whatever it may be, check out orthodoxdepot.com, orthodoxdepot.com. Use promo code COTEL, COTEL, and you'll get 10% off, and you can help me out as well as a good Orthodox company here in the Midwest. So check out orthodoxdepot.com. All right. So before we get in, I don't want to read too much. So before we get into the document that I put together and we look into the battle, that the video that I have, and also the article talking specifically about the Ghost of Genghis Khan, I have a quick introductory video that I found, and I hope it's not copyrighted. So we're gonna find out in just a second. I don't believe it is, but the gentleman's YouTube channel, and he did a good little overview. The gentleman's YouTube channel is over 1 million, so I always worry when it's a major YouTube channel like this. But this is just a quick little introduction and like overview of who the Mad Baron was. This is from the Great War channel on YouTube here. I hadn't followed him, but I thought this video was done pretty good. It's only 10 minutes, so it's a good introduction. And then we have this article here that I want to go over. We're not going to read the whole thing because some of the information already presented and what the first video and my show notes are going to demonstrate. Some of the stuff we already know, but I want to get into this article because it actually highlights, for example, right here, you see this giant Mongolian? This was one of the bodyguards of Roman von Ungern-Sternberg. So when he was believed to be the reincarnation of Genghis Khan, one of his Mongolian bodyguards was this giant right here. And so this is a photo of his bodyguard, included a giant warrior who added a spiritual dimension to Ungern-Sternberg's bizarre campaign. So I want to read a little bit of this article later, but let's get into this video first and sort of introduce, give a holistic narrative synopsis of the life of Roman von Ungern-Sternberg, and then we're going to get into some of my show notes, the article, and then the last thing that I want to show you guys is this. Oh, where'd it go? Oh, here it is right here. This video right here. And I've used some of his videos before and they weren't copyrighted. So I want to give credit to History Marche and his video, because this is actually really good and it's 20 minutes. So we're going to sort of conclude with this really good video. I really love this one. So, all right, let's begin with the first overview.
About Baron von Ungern-Sternberg and the First World War. Nikolai Roman Maximilian von Ungern-Sternberg was born January 10, 1886 in Graz in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. His mother was German and his father Estonian. His father was declared insane, and his mother married another Estonian nobleman and went to live in Reval, which is Tallinn today in Estonia, but was then part of Russia. The family claimed to have Romanov blood, the Russian Tsar's family, in them, and to be partly Mongolian, but in reality, they were mostly German with Hungarian roots. The Baltic German community was well established as an elite class in Estonia, and in the 19th century, many of them pursued Russian military careers in service in Eastern or Central Asia against the unruly Khanates during that period of Russian colonization. The young Roman was obsessed with tales of his ancestors, pirates and bandits. His grades in school were abysmal, but worse than that was his behavior. He wasn't a bully. He was the guy bullies are.
And so I forget if this guy mentioned the abusing of animals, but one of the reasons why a lot of people believe that Ungern-Sternberg was a sociopath is because when he was a kid, he actually would, like, in front of his friends, like, violently hurt animals. And so it was interesting that his father was actually committed to an insane asylum. They were of nobility, and his mother remarried a man, and he was also of nobility. And so Roman actually, like, valorized his aristocratic identity, yet he hardly got along with many of the other aristocrats or other noble families, and certainly did not abide by typical etiquette and demeanor amongst nobility. And so he showed a lack of empathy as a child. And this lack of empathy, I mean, some of the tortures that he did against communists, Jews, Chinese, anybody that was a perceived enemy, pretty horrific. Even amongst some of his own soldiers, some pretty horrific stuff. So he was kind of a sadistic guy, and it may have ran in his family. It may have been something he inherited from his actual biological father.
Scared of a sadistic and violent young man who was eventually expelled from school. His father pulled some strings and got him into the Marine Academy in St. Petersburg, but neither his grades nor his behavior saw any improvement. In fact, to get out of the academy, he volunteered for the army. Russia was currently fighting the Russo-Japanese War. The 19-year-old Roman dreamed of making a difference, but by the time he arrived at the front, the demoralized Russians and the overextended Japanese were at a stalemate. He did not see action, but emerged from the war as a corporal, was very impressed with the Japanese skill and courage, and had seen the Far East for the first time, which to him was the land of old. His grandfather had been a privateer in the service of an Indian prince against the British and had introduced him to Buddhism. He was also interested in astrology and the occult, which were quite popular at that time in Russia and Asia, as the old order seemed ready to crack. The abortive 1905 Russian Revolution took care of that. The Tsarist rule was indeed threatened, and the monarch's response bloody, but the response to his response was violent uprisings. The Estonian peasantry burned down the Ungern-Sternberg estate. This served to confirm Roman's radical beliefs that the peasants were animals led astray by Jews. In fact, Roman was a rabid monarchist who had no patience for ideas of capitalism or liberalism. The Tsar was appointed by God. His father...
And that's what's one of the so interesting things, right? So this guy was not indicative of the sort of liberal scene of Europe. He was about preserving the old world order. He was about monarchy. And even by the time he gets to Mongolia, I mean, he's about sort of medieval kingly type representative. So, again, a very interesting figure who sort of, being German, is right on that precipice between that sort of Western European identity, yet he was a staunch monarchist and pro-Russian nationalist.
Once again pulled some strings, and Roman was enrolled in the prestigious Paul I Military Academy as a cavalry cadet. He was a natural athlete and an excellent horseman, and he graduated and found service in a Cossack regiment, the 1st Argom Regiment of the Za-Baikal Cossacks under General Rennenkampf. They were stationed near Lake Baikal in Siberia and lived a nomadic life on the steppes, riding border patrols against Chinese bandits. This was a world of magic and adventure to Roman. He practiced military Buddhism and brought others to its cause. Among other practices, it promoted celibacy, but allowed unlimited alcohol, opium, and hashish. In 1913, he arrived in the Mongolian capital city of Urga, which could have been medieval if not for hunters with rifles. It had been under Chinese control until 1911 and was now fighting for independence. There, Roman delved deeper into Buddhist and shamanistic studies. He was expelled, however, from the Cossacks for his violent behavior, and only the outbreak of the World War got him reinstated and sent to the Eastern Front. There, he was exposed to some of the most brutal, bloody, stupid fighting of the war, making suicidal charges against entrenched machine guns and artillery. Cossack casualties were 3 to 4 times higher than they were anywhere else in the Russian army. He took part in the invasion of East Prussia, the defeat at Tannenberg, the Battle of Galicia, and the fighting in the Carpathians. He was wounded 5 times, which isn't surprising since he volunteered for the most dangerous missions and rode at the head of formations. Ungern's survival was due partly to blind luck, partly to an almost suicidal absence of fear. As he was to show winning his medals, he could do things so madly heroic that his enemies would often pause in sheer astonishment. The war on the Eastern Front reminded him often of the vast steppes of Central Asia. Instead of the enclosed killing zones of the West, the vast regions and deep forests of the East dwarfed the men, who were surrounded by nothingness with only death ahead of them. Humanity became increasingly absent. Cruelty and violence took its stead. The war worsened him. A large part of his activities as a Cossack were raiding parties, rushing in short, violent bursts deep into enemy lines where there was no time to take prisoners or distinguish between soldier and civilian. He was awarded the Cross of St. George 4th class, but in late 1916, after serving a sentence in military prison for yet another violent, drunken rage against his superiors, was assigned to the Black Baron, General Pyotr Wrangel, and sent to Lake Urmia, now in northern Iran. He was there when the February Russian Revolution of 1917 broke down the machinery of state. The following Kerensky government to Ungarn was a total mess, but at least it was some sort of authority compared to the Bolshevik rule after the October Revolution. But it allowed his regiment to travel to Mongolia once more, to recruit men to fight against the revolutionaries once Russia left the World War. In 1918, counter-revolutionary White Army forces outnumbered the Bolshevik Red Army by a considerable amount, but they lacked cohesion. Anarchists, monarchists, Republicans, socialists, they had different ideologies and were scattered across the former empire, while the Bolsheviks could draw on the industry of Petrograd and Moscow and the remnants of the old army.
You know, I had no idea about this guy.
To know
Features if he
not
be there.
Ungarn believed the salvation of Russia lay with the people of the borders. With the aid of a fake armored train, Mongol warriors, Chinese merchants, Japanese arms dealers and volunteers, as well as help from the Czech Legion and the Americans of the Siberian Expeditionary Force, he began building his army. It didn't hurt that the Cheka, the Red Secret Police, were running a reign of terror in Siberia at the time, and the consequent stream of refugees swelled his ranks. His Special Manchurian Mounted Division crossed the border into Russia. Raids and skirmishes against the Red Guard procured ammunition and supplies, and soon he had his own regime in the Daria region. He called himself Baron and established a feudal rule of nearly medieval tradition. And though his rule was culturally tolerant, violence, or the threat of violence, was the order of the day. So each race was welcome, and just about all gods were, though Jews were hanged on sight, and Bolsheviks brutally tortured before being hanged or clubbed to death. He became known as the Bloody Baron, and rumors and legends about him abounded. He had people skinned alive. He had a pack of wolves that he fed with his enemies. He was the god of war reborn and was favored by the Dalai Lama. It is true that death trains accompanied him, transporting captured enemies to torture chambers, and his Mongolian bodyguards revered him as a god. He, however, saw his violence not as torture, but as punishment and a means to maintain discipline. It's not really my place to talk about post-war activity, though the Russian Civil War certainly ties in with the World War. I'm pretty sure a bunch of you are going to look up the rest of his story, though. Ungarn never abandoned his belief in the restoration of the Tsar, believing that Michael Romanov would rule, not learning of his murder. Ungarn fell out with the other White Army leaders because of his autocratic rule, but he conquered the Mongolian capital at one point and fought the Red Army until his capture and execution. That last happened after his attempt to cross the Gobi Desert without supplies and reach Tibet. This turned even his most diehard supporters to mutiny. His life ended with a trial and a firing squad in September 1921 at the age of 35. Baron von Ungern-Sternberg was quite likely a psychopath, but he was definitely one of the most colorful characters of the Great War and its immediate aftermath. And we thought you'd find his story, though not as important to the war as many of our other bio specials, extremely interesting. I would very much like to thank Marcus.
So that's a quick little overview of his life. You can see very interesting, very colorful. And now I want to transition over to the document to give a little bit more of a historical overview of this guy and really why he's important and why he's probably also forgotten. At least for us in the West, I was not fully aware of him. I mean, and outside of Orthodox circles, which we already love, sort of obscure history, it was one of my brothers at church that was actually quite knowledgeable of the Baron and kind of educated me. So I put this little bit together on the Mad Baron, and fascinating yet often forgotten historical figure, uniquely captivating historical personality. So as we said, he's a Baltic German aristocrat and a white Russian warlord, operated during the turbulent era of the Russian Civil War. He's a fusion of different ideologies, combined European conservatism, Russian Orthodox monarchism, Vajrayana Buddhism, and Mongolian shamanism, and attempted to establish a Buddhist theocratic monarchy in Mongolia. Complex character, psychological portrait, leadership style, brutal yet charismatic. He did seem to be very charismatic, and people wanted to follow him, especially due to his heroism. But eventually, people tended to turn against him just because of how brutal he really was. Known for severe military discipline and ruthless violence, anti-Bolshevik and anti-Semitic actions, personal contradictions and asceticism. So he practiced strict celibacy, inspired by religious and monastic traditions, specifically in Orthodoxy, and yet paradoxically engaged in heavy consumption of alcohol, hashish, and opium. Religious mysticism, again, this sort of divine warrior myth. Mongolians saw him as a divine warrior and possibly the reincarnation of Genghis Khan. And this was due to, again, some of the local prophecies and religious symbolism, effectively legitimizing his rule and inspired loyalty. And this was the Dalai Lama never officially canonized him or identified him as the incarnation of one of the god of wars, because there's multiple gods of wars or gods of war. But the Dalai Lama did sort of give credence to this and saw his actions in the taking over of Urga, the capital of Mongolia, as beneficial. And so he kind of, whether he fully believed it or not, the Dalai Lama, he certainly kind of capitulated and went along with the local reverence and belief that this man was the reincarnation of Genghis Khan and a reincarnation of one of the gods of wars. And his belief in reincarnation, I saw on one thing, it said that he told one of his soldiers or something that when he beheads one of his enemies, he actually considered that him giving them a blessing. One, they didn't have to experience torture, but two, he thought it prevented them from potentially reincarnating into a further sissified entity, an animal, another man or a woman, of something of that sort. So he thought if you're willing to get on your knees and bow before me and I'll cut your head off, at least you'll die with some respect. And I don't know. Some of these legends are hilarious about this guy. Significant historical actions and impact. Again, he's not the most important historical figure during this period, but like I said, successfully captured Urga, and then reinstated the Bogd Khan as ruler. That's the Tibetan ruler of Mongolia. And then influence on Mongolian history. His short rule accelerated Mongolia's subsequent alignment with the Soviet communism, had lasting geopolitical implications for Mongolia's future, and then downfall and execution. Ultimately, he was betrayed, defeated by the Bolshevik Mongolian revolutionary forces. So he found out that some of the Mongolians were actually sympathetic to the Red Army and began attacking them in Mongolia proper. And so they fled into Russia and were reinforced by the Red Army. And so the Mongolians and the Red Army then, because the Mongolians knew Mongolia, knew the terrain and how to move and operate, they helped the Red Army sort of retake Mongolia. And so he was eventually betrayed and captured by his own troops in 1921. And this led to his execution, as I said. So it became a tragic emblem of revolutionary upheaval and ideological extremism. And then speculations on maybe some of the neglect or historical neglect in his importance is that he was kind of geographically in a peripheral context. I mean, most of his story, especially the interesting parts, occur over in Mongolia and Siberia. Complex ideological syncretism is difficult for conventional historical narratives. What exactly is this guy? How do you kind of define him? Or I mean, because it's such a hodgepodge of beliefs. Is he just a sort of pragmatic guy that's all about power? I think maybe to some degree you can make that argument, but he seemed very devout to his Buddhist, his like quasi Christian, it's almost theosophical, Buddhist, shamanic belief system, this weird spirituality. And it reinforced his own identity because it's not only the local Mongolians that believed that he was the reincarnation of Genghis Khan, he believed he was the reincarnation of Genghis Khan. And so, overshadowed by dominant Bolshevik narratives. And then why I think he's important, he offers unparalleled insights into the religious syncretism, charismatic authoritarianism, the violent clash between traditionalism and modernity in Eurasia. And it merits greater attention, both scholarly studies and popular historical discourse. So in regards to this document, I'm not going to read all of it. If you guys want access, again, this whole thing is going to be posted over at the website by tonight. And the last one we did on satanic cults and ritual abuse, that's up at the website as well if anybody wants to see that one. So we know he was born from in Estonia. He's German, aristocrat family. And this kind of gives a little bit more detail to some of the stuff we talked about. Personality and mystical beliefs. I have more on this, but as we said, he combined extreme military discipline and promoted what's called military Buddhism. So obviously Buddhism is supposed to be nonviolent, but there's a sort of theological, philosophical thread within it that sort of condones and advocates for a sort of Buddhist supremacy through military conquest. And he advocated for that type of tradition. And so he combined extreme military discipline with esoteric mysticism, believing himself to be the reincarnated legendary historical figures, including Genghis Khan, and a prophetic agent tasked with restoring traditional monarchy and spirituality to a decadent modern world. His soldiers, although fearful of him, revered him for his supposed invincibility and supernatural powers. And this has to come through the way that he acted during actual battles. And so importance and legacy, his embodiment of ideological extremes in the Russian Civil War, violent anti-Bolshevism, reactionary monarchism, mysticism, and militant eschatology. So we're going to get into, I have a section here on his beliefs on Jews. And it's like he still had like a Christian eschatological framework amongst all the syncretism, because he believed that the Jews were sort of antichrist spirit, or at least were operating to subvert monarchies and traditions and what he believed to be God-appointed hierarchies of authority, and that this was part of a larger nefarious spiritual battle that he believed communism and Judaism were synonymous, and that he then placed a lot of the blame on Jews. So symbolizing the chaotic political and spiritual vacuum following the collapse of the Russian Empire. And it illustrates the intersection between militarism, religion, and politics in the early 20th century, and influencing later figures, especially fascist and nationalist groups, drawn to his esoteric reactionary beliefs and charismatic authoritarianism. And some people have speculated that maybe the Third Reich was aware of this or interested in some sort, because we know that they had a connection back to Tibet, and that's where they get the swastika, of course, the counterclockwise swastika that's notorious with Nazism, and that type of stuff. So people speculate. I have a detailed chronological timeline I put together of his life, so it kind of lays it out. And that's one of the amazing parts, guys. This guy died at the age of 35. I'm 35 right now. And so I was thinking about everything this guy did up to the age of 35. Now, he wasn't like a great world ruler. I mean, this isn't Alexander the Great or something, but just very interesting, right? Early 20th century, and very interesting guy. So this whole timeline here, if you guys are interested, You can check that out. And then here's more on his religious beliefs. So he was born into a Baltic German nobility, was originally raised within the framework of Eastern Orthodox Christianity, which was dominant among the aristocratic military circles in Imperial Russia. And the way I kind of framed his early uprising had a profound belief in traditional hierarchy, monarchy, and divine order. That is quite clear. View of himself as a defender of the Christian monarchy against Bolshevism, which he saw as demonic and apocalyptic. And a commitment to traditional moral order reflected in his stringent disciplined lifestyle and conservative moral values, especially regarding sexuality. Now, as we said, he was also a bit of a drunkard and loved to smoke both opium and hashish. So as I said, however, his embrace of orthodoxy was not orthodox in practice. I've seen some Orthodox kind of appeal to Roman online on X, and I think it's kind of hard to couch this guy or describe him as an Orthodox Christian. But his personality, extreme mysticism, and fascination with Eastern spirituality gradually led him away from standard Christian theology into a realm of like mystical syncretic spirituality. So influence from Buddhism and shamanism. Again, we're talking about Vajrayana, Tibetan Buddhism. While stationed in Siberia and Mongolia, Ungern became deeply enamored with Tibetan Buddhism, particularly its Vajrayana branch, characterized by belief in reincarnation, which he held throughout the rest of his life, and mystical empowerment, the existence of supernatural protectors, fierce deities, and enlightened beings who intervene in human affairs, which he thought, again, he was a reincarnation of one of these gods of war, and a strong millenarian and apocalyptic dimension, expecting transformative religious and political renewal. He aligned these ideas with his vision of restoring traditional monarchy, seeing Mongolia as a center of spiritual renewal to cleanse the world from decadence and materialism. His alignment led him to embrace Mongolian and Tibetan prophecies about a warlike savior who would restore purity and power in Asia. And then regarding shamanism, he was influenced by the belief in ancestral spirits, nature spirits, warrior ghosts guiding his decisions, practices of divination, prophecy, spiritual guidance through shamans, oracles, and seers, and shamanistic rituals performed before battles to ensure victory to invoke warrior spirits. And then why the Mongols believed he was the god of war. So the Genghis Khan mythology is that Mongolians traditionally revered Genghis Khan as a semi-divine figure destined to return or reincarnate to restore greatness and liberate the Mongols from foreign oppression. At the time, Mongolia was under Chinese occupation. This is who, again, Ungern-Sternberg throws out of Urga. And Ungern's military success against Chinese forces strongly resonated with prophecies of a returning Genghis Khan figure who would liberate the Mongols. Appearance and behavior, Ungern deliberately embraced Mongol warrior symbolism, dressing in traditional Mongol clothing, adopting Mongolian customs, and explicitly claiming spiritual authority. He skillfully, in regards to prophecies and omens, he skillfully utilized Tibetan and Mongolian Buddhist oracles, prophecies, and omens to legitimize his rule. His successful conquest of Urga in 1921 seemed miraculous, fulfilling local prophecies that fueled the belief that he was the reincarnation of Genghis Khan. And remember, he did this while being massively, massively outnumbered, and he fooled them by lighting all these fires around the city. And because of the prophecies of the people within the city, the Chinese who were occupying it thought, what if they're right? What if this guy's coming to kill us all? And again, very interesting historical context with all of that. And then his repeated victories against numerically superior enemies seemed supernatural, reinforcing the belief in his divine mandate and identity as the god of war. And then celibacy, moral discipline. He viewed sexuality as spiritually weakening and distracting from his divine militaristic mission. Celibacy was seen as preserving spiritual strength and martial purity, crucial to his self-concept as a divine warrior ascetic. And this is true not only within, some Christian cultures, but generally speaking, I mean, even contemporary, Mike Tyson was famous for not sleeping with women a month before his fights, but throughout history, you watch the movie The Northman, which is about sort of Nordic paganism. And in the beginning of the movie, when the protagonist, his father, comes home, who is king of one of these pagan Nordic tribes, his wife wants to sleep with him. And this was all part of a betrayal. He's getting ready to be betrayed. Betrayed. The king is, and his wife's in on it. She's actually sleeping with another guy. But the king refuses to sleep with his wife because he says, "I need the strength for battle." And so this idea that men's strength was tied with their semen, and that ejaculation actually weakened you and was deleterious in regards to battles and military expeditions, that is a common motif across ancient and medieval culture, just FYI. But the paradox is that he had no problem. So he wouldn't have sex, but he had extensive alcohol use. It was widespread amongst the Russian officers, reflecting a cultural acceptance as well as a coping mechanism for stress and violence of wartime. Alcohol was integrated into his daily military and religious rituals, used to enhance camaraderie, courage, and a sense of divine inspiration. And then hashish and opium. Ungern was used hashish and opium primarily for spiritual and ritualistic purposes, influenced by Mongolian shamanistic and Tibetan tantric traditions, which occasionally use mind-altering substances to achieve altered states of consciousness. Now, here I want to get into his beliefs about the Jews, because it's very interesting. And if you look up anything about the guy, they always talk about him being, anti-Semitic, this or that. Guys, smash that like. We only got 69 likes on the stream. I thought this topic was pretty interesting. I thought more people would actually find it a bit more of an interesting topic, something that we don't talk about all the time. So guys, smash that like. And if you have questions or comments you'd like to support streams like this, please send in a question or some type of support. Would greatly appreciate that. Okay, so Ungern's beliefs about Jews. So Judeo-Bolshevism. So Sternberg saw Jews as the primary architects behind the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917, believing it was part of a broader Jewish conspiracy to dismantle traditional Christian civilization and imperial authority. And so again, this is ironic, right? This guy is a Mongolian, Buddhist, shamanic type incarnation of the god of war, and yet his animosity towards them had to do with his belief that they were undermining Orthodox Christian civilization in Russia. He viewed Bolshevism as inherently Jewish in origin, character, and intent, adopting widely circulated narratives popular among Russian monarchist, conservative Orthodox circles, and right-wing groups at the time. This was all couched within a very interesting apocalyptic framework. So he considered Jews not simply political adversaries, but spiritually malevolent figures, agents of chaos who undermined religious values and order. Ungern-Sternberg integrated these thoughts with his eclectic religious beliefs, perceiving Bolshevism as a demonic force in a literal spiritual sense, and positioning himself as a divine warrior battling this perceived evil. Role of Jews in the destruction of Russia. So he explicitly blamed the Jews for Russia's collapse into revolutionary chaos. He believed they deliberately orchestrated social upheaval, economic sabotage, and political destabilization. To him, Jewish intellectuals, revolutionaries, financiers, and journalists were collectively responsible for subverting Russia's Orthodox Christian identity and dismantling its imperial order. And he accused the Jews of exploiting the revolutionary period's turmoil to seize power, destroy traditional morality, and corrupt Russian society with atheism, materialism, and revolutionary socialism. He adopted a racialized stereotype common among European thought at the time, which characterized Jews as inherently deceitful, cunning, morally corrupt, greedy, parasitic, and subversive, and saw Jewish communities as fundamentally alien elements threatening the racial and cultural purity of Russians and Mongolians alike. Because there's a famous instance in which, when he took over Urga, they hung and executed all Jews within the city. His beliefs drew heavily on the infamous protocols of the Elders of Zion, widely circulated in reactionary Russian military and monarchist circles, reinforcing his belief in a Jewish global conspiracy. Political manifestations. Ungern-Sternberg's anti-Semitic beliefs translated directly into brutal violence during his brief rule in Mongolia. His regime actively orchestrated violent pogroms against Jewish communities. Bolshevik sympathizers and individuals merely suspected of sympathizing with communism or revolutionary ideologies. Jews captured during his campaigns were typically executed, tortured, or subjected to public violence. Ungern explicitly framed these actions as necessary purifications against Bolshevik conspirators and subversive elements, justifying atrocities as part of a sacred religious war against evil. And then Ungern-Sternberg systematically propagated these beliefs amongst his soldiers and the local Mongolian population, creating widespread paranoia. His personal hatred and suspicion translated into policy and practice, legitimizing anti-Jewish sentiments within the ranks of his Asian cavalry division. And then connection with the broader right-wing movements at the time, Ungern-Sternberg's ideas paralleled the broader European right wing emerging after World War I, especially within defeated monarchies and right-wing paramilitary groups across Eastern and Central Europe. He positioned himself within a broader global struggle against what he saw as a Jewish-driven communist threat. So this whole document, again, we didn't go over the timeline or anything, but that whole document's going to be available over at the website if anybody's interested in that. So you guys can check that out if you'd like. Erroneous Decius throws in 5. Thank you so much. I just wanted to give a little back for the work and helpful streams that brought me to the church. Well, glory to God, brother. I'm humbled if I've helped in any way, or I'm sure I can speak on behalf of any of the other content creators out there that would be potentially have influenced you in any way. We're humbled to have supported, and glory to God. My wife, 2 kids, and I will be baptized Saturday. Glory to God, brother. That's amazing. That's amazing. Really, really happy for you, man. And welcome home. Welcome home. So thank you very much for the support. And Abject Fool throws in a generous $50 super chat. Thank you so much, Abject Fool. He just says support. Really appreciate that, my man. And let me just check the dono chats before we get into the document here. Looks like somebody sent something in. Joseph Orthodox throws in 5 over on Streamlabs. And he says, hey, brother, love the work. Well, thank you so much, Joseph. How long do you usually spend presenting a topic? I loved your Western USA one about cowboys. Wishing you luck with your PhD and the rest of Lent. Well, thank you so much, Joseph. Sponsored streams are usually between 2 to 3 hours. I spend a lot of time preparing for sponsored streams because they're sponsored. And I want to get out of the habit of the last handful of sponsored streams have been almost 4 hours long. And that, so typically if you sponsor a stream, it's going to be between, I always tell people 1.5 hours to 3 hours, depending on what the topic is. So if you're interested in sponsoring a stream, Joseph, please do so. And then I'll reach out to you and you can let me know all the details of what it is you would like to be sponsored. So thank you very much for that, Joseph. Really appreciate it. And David James Flood throws in 5. Thank you so much, brother. He says, thanks for the interesting topic, DPH. Well, thank you, brother, for the support. I really do appreciate that. Thank you for gifting COTEL Crew memberships and sending in support. I'm trying to do my part. So thank you guys so much for supporting the work. And I hope that it's interesting and useful. There's not a whole lot of streams about him. And I found about 10 YouTube videos that are about him. A couple were like more documentary style. So there's plenty of content out there on him, and there's articles and stuff, but not a topic a lot of people are speaking about. And it's kind of juxtaposed and has at least one foot in our Orthodox world. So I thought it was something interesting, something unique. And I've been wanting to speak about this for, as I said, the men's group meeting back in January is when I became aware of it. So I was going to do it sometime in February. It's just with the dissertation and focusing on that, I didn't have time to present the topic. So here we are now. So thank you guys very much for being here. Smash that like. And let's get into the next section of today's stream. Okay. So we watched this video, and you guys can go find find his Wikipedia if you guys want to read all that. I thought it'd be a little bit boring to do all that. So I did find this article and this was one of the first articles I read in regards to who this guy was after learning about him at the men's group. And so the ghost of Genghis Khan, after the Russian Revolution, one young officer forged a career so strange that it went down in legend. Tim Newark examines the short and bloody life of Baron Roman von Ungern-Sternberg and recalls his bizarre mission to create his own barbarian empire in the Russian Far East. So some of this kind of goes over his early life. I'm going to skip some of that. I want to get into it. Provides details in regards to his relations with the Mongols and stuff that isn't in any of the videos and isn't specifically in my document. So we're going to kind of skip around this document here, but it says, when the Russian Empire fell in the second decade of the 20th century, it brought a time of civil war and feuding warlords. Out of this context arose a man who startled even his bloodthirsty contemporaries with the extent of his violence. But then again, this man believed he was the reincarnation of Genghis Khan, one of history's greatest conquerors, and that he was on a mission to recreate the great Khan's barbarian empire. The man was Baron Ungern-Sternberg, one of the strangest and cruelest military figures of the 20th century. And so this goes into his origins, his family, yada, yada, yada. As a young man, barely in his 20s, Ungern-Sternberg's hungry mind was filled with stories of Genghis Khan, the founder of the Mongol Empire. And this was translated into reality when he was himself put in charge of a troop of Mongol horsemen. He immediately found a kinship with them, admiring their innate martial skills and fearlessness in battle. He wanted to be like these silent, frightening warriors and made a step towards this by adopting Buddhism. And so there's a photo of him. You can see him with one of his medals on. So not a physically dominating figure. It says a rare photograph of Baron Roman von Ungern-Sternberg. Increasingly, his men came to see him not as a great commander, but as a suicidal madman. A world on fire. Gives you a little bit of the historical context. Ungern-Sternberg loathed the Bolsheviks. He pledged to restore the Tsar to his throne and then wipe out the revolution mongers among the white races. His hatred of the communists was no doubt intensified when he heard of their crushing blows against his own homeland of Latvia. Now, in his early 30s, he was a formidable warrior in his own right. Fighting for 4 years in the war against the Germans, he displayed great courage and leadership, being rapidly promoted to the rank of Major General and awarded the Cross of St. George. His fellow officers had learned to respect and fear him. Only his reckless courage prevented his being cashiered by various commanding officers under whom he had served, recorded a contemporary. When Ungern-Sternberg entered a cafe, other occupants retired, for he was an expert with his gun. In his drinking bouts, he slew many of his own officers. So that was another thing, is that he was in multiple duels, which actually got him in problems with his Russian superiors, because he would go into battle. Again, he would do these heroic things, but he was always getting in conflict with people. And again, this guy ran towards death. And so if you guys got into a drunken argument with him in a tavern, he would challenge you to a duel pretty quickly. And he was very serious about it. And he killed multiple other soldiers due to these duels. In July 1918, the Tsar and his family were executed. And by the 1920, the Great Civil War between the White and Red Russians had ground to a halt with the crushing of the counter-revolutionaries by the Bolsheviks. Ungern-Sternberg found himself out on a limb in the middle of Siberia with his beloved Tsar gone and the White Russian army disintegrating. He now sought his own barbarian destiny. The land of the Mongols that he so admired had been invaded by the Chinese, who had taken advantage of Russia's misfortunes to increase their own empire. Believing himself by now to be the new Genghis Khan, Ungern-Sternberg was certain it was his duty to release the Mongols from their Chinese yoke. With an army of ex-White Army Russians and native warriors, he would rebuild the empire of the Mongols and then march against the revolutionaries in the West. So Ungern-Sternberg's army numbered approximately 6,000 warriors, 4,000 of these being ex-White Army Russians, the rest being Mongols or other Siberian horsemen. To this were added the Japanese advisors and some 70 armored bodyguards donated by the Dalai Lama in Tibet, who had been promised an extension of his religious realm if the Baron was successful. Ungern-Sternberg had also fulfilled his self-image as a Mongol warlord by marrying a Mongolian princess who traveled with the army in the company of the Baron's Buddhist spiritual advisors. And then his barbarian fantasy. So let's see. Do I want to read all this stuff? We'll read a little bit of it. With the bizarre entourage, Ungern-Sternberg advanced into Mongolia in October 1920. Dmitry Alyoshin described the Baron as wearing an exotic combination of cherry red Chinese jacket with blue Imperial Russian Army breeches and surrounded by barbaric luxury and glory. Before his army, refugees began to stream, fueling the stories of his barbaric behavior. Alyoshin recorded the appalling punishments meted out to anyone who crossed the Baron's path. The village of Bulaktai was burned with the inhabitants locked in their huts. Captain Vishnevsky was whipped to death. The Baron strangled Colonels Lihachev and Yahontov. His adjutant killed Kordakov just to get his young and pretty wife. And the target of Ungern-Sternberg's campaign was Uraga, which we've discussed, the capital of Mongolia. And then in the 26th of October, Ungern-Sternberg led his attack on the Mongolian capital at night. Ladislao Forbath, a Western traveler and trader within the city, described the impact of the assault. Quote, "Suddenly there came a high-pitched hiss, immediately followed by a terrific explosion, and a cloud of dust rose in front of the horse. We guessed that Baron Ungern-Sternberg was bombarding the Chinese barrack close by, and we were confirmed in this belief as grenade after grenade explode in front of the house." And then we're going to get into the suicidal bluff. So how did he take over a city that was outnumbered by Chinese? So on the night of the 31st of January, in snow and darkness, Ungern-Sternberg's horde returned to the hills outside Uraga as he instructed his men to begin another assault. This time he employed psychological warfare in order to give the impression of a far greater army than he in fact possessed. The Baron had some of his men light fires in the surrounding hills so the Chinese might think that his army had encircled them. According to Alyoshin, the Baron's army had dwindled severely owing to the initial lack of success in the bitter winter. There were now only 1,700 bandits against 12,000 Chinese soldiers. This was a suicidal bluff that Ungern-Sternberg had no other choice if he had wished to fulfill his barbarian fantasy. As 0 hour approached, very high winds came across the Mongolian steppe and delayed the arrival of the Baron's ox-drawn artillery, and it was drawn by the time that the main attack began. With the shock of surprise lost, the Chinese were able to scramble to their guns and let loose a storm of shells and machine gun fire that hammered the attacking Mongols and Russians. The Mongol horsemen were particularly vulnerable to the sustained fire and also least likely to hang around to be mowed down, unlike the Russian veterans of World War I. A special assault squad of Russians and Tibetans had greater luck. They successfully managed to free the Bogd Khan, the living Buddha, from Chinese imprisonment, also grabbing a store of Chinese ammunition and machine guns in the palace, which they rushed to the main battlefront. And so here's this was the living Buddha right here, the Bodha Khan. And then, like I said, this was one of some of his bodyguards. Look how big that Mongolian dude is. The morale amongst the Chinese defenders was low, and over 3 days, at least 2,000 Chinese soldiers deserted. On the third day, Ungern-Sternberg led his final attack. Immediately, the Chinese opened unsystematic and mad shooting, recalled Alyoshin. Machine guns began their dreadful cluttering. The temptation was too great, and contrary to orders, we dashed forward into battle. The Baron was carried away by the mad impulse also, as we saw him galloping on his white horse in the front of our lines, directing us toward the enemy's barbed wire. Hand-to-hand fighting quickly followed, with the Russian cavalry attacking the Chinese from the rear. Alyoshin gives a frightening vision of the barbaric chaos. Mad with revenge and hatred, the conquerors began plundering the city. Drunken horsemen galloped along the streets and killing at their fancy, breaking into houses, dragging property outside into the dirty streets, dressing themselves in rich silks found in the shops. In front of the Chinese banks, lines were formed where each man was given the right to plunge his bloody hand inside the strong boxes and get what his luck would bring him. Some were fortunate enough to drag out gold coins and bullion. Some were less fortunate and got silver, while others found only paper currency and banknotes, which they immediately threw into the street as worthless. This was all after a barbarian army. Worse was to follow in the 3-day orgy of violence. On the morning of the 4th day, Ungern-Sternberg ordered an end to the bloodshed, rape, and plunder. Many of his warriors were too drunk to notice, having sometimes shot their own comrades in the chaos of the moment, and these were strung up immediately as a warning to the rest. A shopkeeper somewhat rashly asked the Baron if the corpses hanging outside his shop could be cut down, as he was losing valuable business. There's one legend about the Baron too, that he had like a wild pack of wolves, and that some of the tortures he administered was allowing the wolves to eat people. And there was one thing that I read that some of his subordinate soldiers did something that bothered the Baron. I forget what exactly it was, but he basically forced them to wrestle his wild wolves. So pretty interesting legends regarding this guy. And through luck and bluff, Baron Ungern-Sternberg had achieved his barbarian destiny. He now lived like an ancient warlord, surrounded by the gilded trappings of a Khan on the steppes, along with his Mongolian princess. Protecting him were Buddhist bodyguards clad in medieval armor, and a horde of Cossack and Mongolian horsemen, all defended by an array of 20th century weapons. With this vision of himself as the new Genghis Khan completed, he set about preaching a crusade in which he declared it was the duty of every white Russian and every Mongolian to crush the Reds and destroy the communist realm. His ambition now fully inflated, Ungern-Sternberg pulled up his tents and advanced northwards out of Mongolia toward the road of Urga near Lake Baikal, with the intention of cutting the Trans-Siberian Railway line between Irkutsk and eastern China. In the 27th of May of 1921, on the advice of his soothsayers, Ungern-Sternberg declared himself Emperor of all Russia. For the ears of the Reds in Moscow, he made one further pledge: to plant an avenue of gallows from Mongolia to Moscow, from which he would hang every Bolshevik he could lay his hands on. Quote, "The tribes of Genghis Khan's successors were awakened," the Baron told his followers. Quote, "Nobody shall extinguish the fire in the heart of the Mongols. In Asia, there will be a great state from the Pacific and Indian Ocean to the shore of the Volga. The wise religion of Buddha shall run to the north and the west." And so here's a photo. So a killing field of Mongolia showing piles of bones and skulls left behind by Ungern-Sternberg's army, which executed all prisoners. So this is you can see all the skulls and bones. And then Final Destiny, it just gets into how he was eventually betrayed by his fellow soldiers who wanted to mutiny due to his desire to cross the Gobi Desert. And so we'll read a couple. When the whites gained the upper hand, the Baron was true to his words of retribution. "We shot every prisoner," wrote Alyoshin. "The prisoners were forced to dig large communal graves at which they were subsequently lined up." Photographs survived of the killing fields taken a few years later, in which piles of bleached skulls and bones lay scattered on the bleak Mongolian steppe where they fell. Realizing they could expect no mercy whatsoever, the Bolsheviks fought with the tenacity and even more cunning than the Baron. The Mongolian Bolsheviks, so again, the Mongols who found refuge amongst the Red Army, could see their own great barbarian prize to be plucked out of the chaos of civil war, and they possessed a power as violent and ruthless as that of the Baron. In many ways, Ungern-Sternberg had met his match in the form of another Mongolian warlord. Even the Baron's men were becoming weary of the constant struggle as they looked on their leader. now without a jacket and wearing on his naked chest numerous Mongolian talismans and charms hung on a bright yellow cord. They saw not a great commander, but a suicidal madman. In the middle of a cold Mongolian night, a small number of Baron's warriors crept out of their tents and assembled a machine gun in front of their commander's ornate yurt. Praying to their gods while they pulled the trigger, the machine gun tore through the panels of felt, throwing splinters of metal and wood everywhere. When the gunners paused, they were shocked to see the Baron was still alive, running out of the chaos to mount his horse and disappear into the darkness. Maybe the Baron truly was the ghostly reincarnation of Genghis Khan. The Great Crusade was over, however. Hounded by the Red Army and the Mongolian communists, the White Army disintegrated, with many of the Russians escaping to China. Urga fell to the Red Army, and Mongolia became a communist nation. A few diehards accompanied the Baron into the wilderness, but he was badly wounded, and his mind no longer able to conjure up any plan. Alyoshin accompanied him until, bleeding, exhausted, and helpless, Baron von Ungern-Sternberg slid from his saddle and fell to the ground unconscious. Days later, a Red Army patrol came across the Baron, writhing in agony as he tried to shake giant ants off his body. Uncertain of who this half-eaten figure was, a Russian cavalryman dismounted and stepped towards him. "Who are you?" he asked softly. "I am Baron von Ungern-Sternberg," screamed the broken man in response. The Bolsheviks threw Ungern-Sternberg over the back of one of their horses, and according to the Times of 13th September 1921, he was exhibited as a monster at stations across the Trans-Siberian Railway. At Novosibirsk in Siberia, he was put on the trial for his many crimes. Unsurprisingly, the Soviet court found him guilty and sentenced him to death several times over. On the 15th of September in 1921, he stood in front of a firing squad and smiled before a crack of gunshots finally ended his barbarian fantasy. And so this is the last photo of the Mad Baron before his execution right here. And so you can see, looks like a pretty disheveled and broken man. But with all that being said, I now want to kind of conclude the last part of today's stream on this, a sort of overview of his military campaigns by History of Marque. So let me just double check, make sure nobody sent in any super chats. Oh, Jay Hamza throws in 20. Thank you so much, Jay. He says, "I find these to be great topics. Usually is about a confusing ideology about Jews and the Jesuits. The Jesuits are actually the ones who helped Bolshevik Revolution." Yeah, a lot of people helped the Bolshevik Revolution. The entire central banking finance structure of the West also aided them. Without money coming from London, the Bolshevik Revolution could have never happened. So a lot of different players at play. But thank you so much, Jay, for the support. Really appreciate that, my brother. And let's just dive into this last video. So smash that like, guys. So here is one of the best. This is probably one of the better videos, at least I believe, covering, again, the ghost of Genghis Khan. So check it out.
When the Russian Civil War broke out as a direct result of the Bolshevik Revolution in late 1917, several anti-communist commanders took up arms to fight the Red Army. Among the stories of all those intriguing commanders, with each one a story so brutal, heroic, and tragic as the others, was one Cossack commander who truly stood out in eccentricity. Roman von Ungern-Sternberg was of Baltic German noble origin, but fell in love with the Far East, its history and culture. He was convinced he was a descendant of Genghis Khan, adopted a hybrid ideology of combined Buddhism, Christianity, and samurai influences, and led his clique of merciless Cossacks in brutal battle against the communists, but not before conquering Mongolia, albeit for a brief while, and declaring himself its head of state. He waged a campaign of terror, without any mercy towards his opponents. Still, at the same time, according to historians, a modern-day independent Mongolia would not be possible without his activities. He became known as the Mad Baron in history books, an epitaph that is rather fitting for this larger-than-life character. And soup serve and access bailable accounts that I can't already see a plan on code. In 1886, Roman was born into a noble Baltic German family in Graz in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Although his mother was German and his father, Theodor Freiherr von Ungern-Sternberg, was of Baltic German descent, the young boy spoke German, English, Estonian, French, and Russian. When he was just 2 years old, the von Ungern-Sternbergs moved to Reval, modern-day Tallinn, in the Russian governorate of Estonia. Roman grew up there, traveling between Reval and his family's estate, situated on the island of Hiiumaa. His parents divorced during his childhood. His father was committed to a mental asylum, and his mother remarried the Baltic German Oskar von Heuningen-Huen. Already as a child, Roman was obsessed with romanticized accounts of his ancestors. Teutonic knights conquering the Baltic states, but also of Mongols and their domination under Genghis Khan. At the root lay the belief that the Ungern-Sternbergs were related to a descendant of Genghis Khan, although no conclusive evidence supports this. Besides enjoying and losing himself in the tales of old, he was a nasty kid. Stories revealed he bullied kids and bullied bullies. He tortured animals, and on more than one occasion, parents forbade their kids to interact with him. His grades suffered, although he did excel in sports and physical activity. He was expelled from the gymnasium in Revel, upon which his stepfather enrolled him in the Imperial Naval Academy in St. Petersburg. Roman, who began referring to himself as Ungern von Sternberg, was a dedicated monarchist and patriot, but describing him as an ideal officer would be far from the truth. In fact, he loathed protocol, formalities, and he shunned the elite networks of nobility he had access to. Ungern preferred to spend his time with regular soldiers, enjoying the raw lives and crude humor. And when war broke out with Japan in 1904, he eagerly jumped at the opportunity to search for action and adventure in the Far East. He served in the Imperial Russian Army during the Russo-Japanese War, although by the time he arrived at the front, most of the fighting was over already, and Russia soon accepted their defeat. This was the first time he visited the Far East of Russia and rubbed shoulders with the Mongolian, Chinese, and even Japanese cultures. 8 years after the war ended, Ungern received the Service Medal, casting doubt on the generally accepted narrative he did not see action. During the Russo-Japanese War, the 1905 Russian Revolution spread through Russia. Although not conclusive in dethroning Tsar Nicholas for now, peasants in rural areas did take up arms against the upper classes. The same goes for Estonian peasants, who reportedly burned down Ungern's family estate. When news reached him, as he himself was still in the Far East at this point, he allegedly developed utter contempt for the masses, thinking of them as no more than wild animals. This only cemented his ultra-nationalist and monarchist convictions, having a deep-seated hatred against moderate or left-wing movement. Clearly, he didn't fit in with the other Russian officers. Whereas they all attempted to acquire prestigious postings close to Europe, 22-year-old Roman was sent to Transbaikal. Translating to Beyond Lake Baikal, frankly, searching for postings further away from Europe could be pretty challenging. Located at the Russian-Mongolian-Chinese border in South Siberia, Roman served as an officer among the Amur Cossacks for the next 5 years. Having a notoriously short temper, he engaged in at least one duel during this time. He thrived there, though, and for the rest of his life he would both feel a connection with the Cossacks and with the Siberian and Mongolian regions. But when in 1914 the First World War broke out, he was sent to the European front. Ungern served in multiple Cossack units at the Eastern European and Southern Caucasus front, fighting against Austria-Hungary and the Ottoman Empire. From 1914, he spent 2 years fighting in Galicia, current-day Ukraine and Poland. Now, something you should know about the Eastern Front in the First World War is that it saw just as much, if not more, senseless slaughter as the Western Front. Infantry and cavalry charged into machine guns without much regard for human life, and Cossack casualties were exceptionally high, sometimes even quadruple the number of regular units. Ungern commanded the Zabaikal Cossacks regiment and quickly made a name for himself because he tended to volunteer for the most dangerous charges. And when charges were taking place, he rode at the head of the cavalry unit, charging into barbed wire, machine guns, and the general horror you would expect trench warfare to bring. Throughout the war, Ungern received every possible order an officer of his rank could receive, including the Order of St. George, the highest military decoration for commissioned officers. Another Baltic German officer of the Imperial Russian Army, Pyotr Wrangel, also known as the Black Baron, wrote about Ungern in a rather revealing manner. He lauded his heroism and self-sacrifice, describing his natural state as that of war. Yet he also criticized him, writing that among officers and other noblemen, he acted out. He simply could not properly participate in more sophisticated circles and adhere to etiquette, resulting in constant reprimands, fights, and disciplinary measures. This came to a head in 1916, when a fight with another officer escalated into a duel. The fight was the straw that broke the camel's back. Ungern's superiors were fed up with the recalcitrant horseman and threw him in military prison. When they released him in December that year, he was transferred to the Caucasus, where the war against the Ottomans was waging on. Here, Ungern served under Captain Grigory Semyonov. This mustached Cossack captain had part Buryat ancestry and spoke both Mongolian and Buryat fluently. These languages and cultures weren't especially popular among certain elites, but the raw Cossack cavalryman proved a welcome asset against the Ottomans. Semyonov and Ungern-Sternberg hit it off thanks to their shared appreciation for Mongolian culture.
Hey guys, in the chat, I just posted a question. Curious what your guys' thoughts are on the Mad Baron. So now that you guys have kind of got the full overview, and as we're wrapping up this last video, curious what your guys' thoughts were after all this. I mean, a man who believes to be the reincarnation of Genghis Khan, a reincarnated god of war within Vajrayana Buddhist theology, somebody who was basically intoxicated every day of his adult life, either alcohol, opium, or hashish, and yet was a staunch defender of the Orthodox Church and Russian monarchy, and believed that Bolshevism and communism was a Jewish effort to undermine sort of Christian morality and Christian civilization. Very, very interesting guy. So I'm curious what everybody's thoughts are.
The fact both men weren't exactly popular among their peers. Contemporaries and historians alike credit them with brutal personalities, both to enemies and their own soldiers. By 1917, Ungern reached the rank of Vojskovoy Starshina, the equivalent of lieutenant colonel for Cossacks. Around that time, the two men attempted to organize an Assyrian Christian regiment to take up arms against the Ottomans. But during the fighting in the Caucasus and recruiting troops in modern-day Iran, developments behind the front line steered Russia's history in a wildly different direction. The Russian Empire was one of the great empires that collapsed as a result of the First World War. In 1917, the February Revolution overthrew Tsar Nicholas II, and later that year, the Bolshevik Revolution marked the beginning of what would become the Soviet Union. But not before many different war parties fought an incredibly bloody, brutal, and gruesome civil war, where both the Bolsheviks and the so-called whites spared nobody opposing them. These loosely organized white military units consisted of monarchists, conservatives, but even liberals, as long as they opposed communism. In the Caucasus, the Lieutenant General Anton Denikin commanded an anti-communist volunteer force. In the southwest, the Black Baron Pyotr Wrangel commanded the Caucasus Volunteer Army. The fair-mustached Nikolai Yudenich led troops in the Baltics. And in the Far East, Admiral Alexander Kolchak declared himself supreme leader and commander-in-chief of all Russian land and sea forces. Ungern, a convinced monarchist, bloodthirsty and ready as ever for war, joined the White Army together with Semyonov, who assumed command of the Baikal Cossacks and became their ataman. Although the White Army sounds like a unified front against the Bolsheviks, it in fact consisted of a wide variety of groups and stakeholders. Due to the vast size of the former Russian Empire, many of these groups weren't even in contact with each other, although they fought on the same side. Ungern's goal for the next few years was to restore the Romanov monarchy, preferably by putting Grand Duke Michael on the throne. It is widely assumed he never became aware of Grand Duke Michael's execution, which took place in June 1918. Ungern had always been a strange fellow at any rate, I'm sure you agree. But around this time he supposedly had a spiritual revelation from Buddha. Since that moment, he was convinced he was Buddha's reincarnation, tasked with restoring Genghis Khan's Mongol Empire. Historians noted Ungern fused strains of Christianity and Buddhism together with other spiritual influences, such as asceticism and Japanese samurai customs. That didn't mean he lived an entirely pure life, as prescribed by Christianity, because his own form of spiritual belief system allowed for the generous consumption of alcohol and prolific bloodshed. Ungern and Semyonov, together with their cavalry unit, trekked eastward towards Outer Mongolia and eastern Siberia, basically the Transbaikal region Ungern was stationed in a decade before. In February 1919, Ungern formed his multi-ethnic Asiatic Cavalry Division, operating under Semyonov's command. He became a robber baron, terrorizing the local population with indiscriminate killings and theft, leading many locals to side with the Red Army, often just as bloodthirsty as Ungern's Cossack unit. In late summer 1920, Ungern and his cavalry unit invaded Mongolia, embroiled in its own war of independence against Chinese troops. About 7,000 Chinese troops held Mongolia's capital, Urga, modern-day Ulaanbaatar. Enjoying support from Mongolian clergy, the Imperial Japanese Army, and the 8th Bogd Gagin, the Great Khan, Ungern made plans to capture Urga. His first besiegement failed, but the second time, together with 1,500-odd men, he managed to capture the city, defeating the Chinese troops. They restored the 8th Bogd Khan, who awarded Ungern the title of Hereditary Grand Duke Darkhan Koshoi Chin Wang in the dignity of Khan. Semyonov promoted Ungern to lieutenant general. The small Jewish population living in Urga was massacred. Any suspected communist they caught was subject to torture before execution. Ungern also established his own secret police, which became notorious for its disregard for human lives. Yet when Ungern's power was somewhat consolidated, although by no means do I mean it was a stable situation, did he introduce oddly progressive policy. He founded a library for the people, established schools for the youth, attempted to reform the economy, issued religious tolerance edicts, excluding Jews, and appointed offices for public sanitation and keeping the streets clean. When it came to prisoners, Ungarn allowed the Mongolian populace to buy the freedom of those arrested in order to improve their karma. Still, Ungern's unpredictable behavior led to issues among the higher ranks, not to mention that his officers misbehaved and were described by contemporaries as a bunch of brutal warriors, taking pleasure in the execution of enemies and sometimes even ordinary citizens. Pursuing his goal of establishing a great Mongol Khanate with himself at its head, Ungern made many enemies. In the north, the tide of the war was rapidly shifting in the Bolsheviks' favor, with many White Army commanders surrendering and fleeing or being captured and executed. When Ungern captured Urga and took control, many Mongol nationalist and communist sympathizers fled over the border into Russian territory. They formed the Mongol government in exile and received support from the Red Army. These revolutionaries rejected the 8th Bogd Khan and Ungern's presence. In March 1921, they launched an invasion into Mongolia. Not aware of the Reds having conquered the majority of the Siberian territory, Ungern was convinced he enjoyed support from Mongol and Siberian locals. He agreed to meet a Red Army envoy in Siberia, but he barely received local support when he arrived. Leading a severely weakened cavalry unit, Ungern engaged in multiple battles against the better equipped and numerically superior Red Army throughout the summer. In July, Urga was captured by the Red Army. Realizing he wouldn't be able to recapture Urga, Ungern traveled to Transbaikal in an attempt to replenish his forces. Penetrating deep into Russian territory, he had to retreat when he realized large Red Army units chased him. Fleeing to Mongolia again, he made plans to cross the Gobi Desert and reach Tibet. Having barely any supplies, his near-suicide mission to Tibet led to his demise. Fed up with his exceedingly erratic behavior, even his most loyal officers mutinied at this point. In August, following a failed assassination attempt, his men tied him up and sold him to a guerrilla Red Army detachment. After a 6-hour show trial, 35-year-old Ungern was executed by a firing squad. These eerie images are photographs of the moment right before his execution. And like that, the life of the Mad Baron ended, a moving and tumultuous life. He supposedly swallowed his Order of St. George and other military medals to prevent them from falling in godless communist hands. Although this is based on hearsay, I think the fact it is plausible he did just that proves how much of an unconventional person he was. Thank you so much.
So that is the life of the Bloody Baron, the Ghost of Genghis Khan, Roman von Ungern-Sternberg. And Austin threw in $5. He says, great stream. What a crazy bastard. Yeah, he was definitely that. And I want to reflect on some of the comments you guys made, asking what's kind of the feel for the chat of von Ungern-Sternberg. And Nathan says, not a fan of a stupid demon worshiper, but you have to admire his tenacity. Yes, you do have to admire his tenacity and his bravery. Now, was he psychopathic? His fearlessness and his sort of willingness to die and charge headlong into machine gun fire on horseback. Strange, very strange guy. One person says he despised commies. Anybody that shares this view is aces in my book. So Define Irony ones, he definitely hated communists. Anybody who is antagonistic towards the Bolsheviks or communism, generally speaking, you will find an ally in Ungern, that's for sure. He hated them absolutely, and he equated with communism. So again, this was just his framework. He equated Judaism to communism, and that related to atheism, materialism, and socialism. All of that was basically in one umbrella for him, and he absolutely despised all of it. Then Austin Graham says, I'm wondering if his favorite childhood snack was lead paint chips. Not sure. David James Flood says, absolute mad lad. Yeah, he was definitely that. And Walk with the Spirit says, based but needed revelation. Yeah, he certainly, and that's where maybe we'll disagree. I mean, the question is, do you guys consider him Christian? I don't consider him Christian, but at least some of the sentiments he had, I find sympathy towards. And then Irania Desus says, reminds of a cooler Lawrence of Arabia. Except, yeah, and he wasn't a tool of British intelligence either. Stuart Little says, crazy white boy with passion in his heart. He definitely had that. What if he was really the great Khan and y'all don't know? Maybe, but it failed the prophecies because Mongolia was supposed to arise to a sort of superior position once the reincarnation of the great Khan was supposed to come and liberate them, which didn't turn out to happen. David James says, guys like this are the archetypal anti-heroes. They committed the most heinous of acts, and yet there is something admirable about them. Yeah, I would say that too, that there's, again, the fact that he was like torturing animals at a young age, got kicked out of about everything he was a part of, reprimanded multiple times by his authorities in the Russian military. And yet at least his principles could be weird, mixture of shamanism, Buddhism, and Orthodox Christianity and all this different stuff, but hated communism, hated atheism, hated socialism, hated outright capitalism too. The guy was not, he basically despised the liberal world order. I mean, he was an arch defender of the old world, of monarchy. And he absolutely believed that monarchy was divinely appointed by God. Alex says, Barron was born a Christian and died a Christian. He also died with, like the story, again, I don't know if it's true. It was just one of the stories that I read that he had this Buddhist shamanic medallion. I don't know if it was the 8-pegged wheel, the wheel of Dharma. I saw some depiction claim that was it, but he had some type of shamanic Buddhist medallion that ricocheted one of the bullets when he was in front of the firing squad and injured one of the Red Army soldiers. So, would a Christian die wearing that? I'm not sure. But though he clearly did not fit into the standard mold of one thinks of a Christian. I mean, he did think in Christian apocalyptic terms. I mean, that's what's interesting is like he fused all this Buddhist shamanic stuff into a sort of Christian eschatology as well. And then Alex said the driving force behind his campaign and the cause he devoted his life was simply to destroy atheistic communism, defend religious belief and traditional authority. That's true. I can agree with you on that, Alex. That is essentially what his mission was. Again, you could claim he was sociopathic, psychopathic, probably rightfully so. But his war, his battle, and his mind was against atheist communism and the defending of traditional order, the old world structure. And he saw World War I, and I'm sure if he had been alive, World War II as the total undermining of the old world structure, which he essentially was fighting for. So yeah, that's I'd agree with that. And Enzo sends in $9.99. No comment. Thank you so much, brother. Really appreciate that. Alex said, usually when one is about to face eternity, truth comes out. And in spite of his religious dabbling, I think it is extremely significant. When he gave his vital statistics to his Soviet captors, he identified as a Christian. Oh, okay. I didn't read that. So interesting little tidbit, Alex. Thank you for that. So whatever you think, whether Christian or not, certainly a strange form of Christianity. Tapio says, would love to see an apocalypse now type film of this guy's life. It would be fast. I mean, this dude's life could absolutely be a Hollywood film. And it would actually be really captivating because you could show how mad this guy was and how violent he was. And at the same time, the bravery and the courage and the heroism of him, and create a really interesting, as David James Flood said, a sort of interesting anti-hero, because it's in some degree, and it'd be, of course, Hollywood, I doubt they would even do a justified portrayal of him because of the quote anti-Semitism, because of his anti-communism, his anti-socialism, his even anti-capitalism, and his defending of the monarchy. They would probably not portray him as a figure that you could even find as an anti-hero. It would probably just be an outright demonic characterization. But it would be a fascinating film if somebody did it properly and just sort of objectively addressed and explicated and performed his life. It would be a fascinating film. True, the world he grew up in was already in chaos. It absolutely was. And I mean, he's right at the end of the 19th century and the 20th century. And that was a major turning point in history. And World War I was essentially the ending of European monarchy. So he was witnessing, no matter what you think of him, I mean, he was right to hate capitalism and socialism because he saw either one of those as totally undermining the monarchical rule of the old world, which he was a defender of. Seth L says it's a refreshing image because all the theophist and syncretic types are usually kiddies, although we can't paint a positive image on someone just because he's based or whatever. Yeah, it's a conflicting image. There's a lot going on here. So anyways, just curious what you guys' thoughts are. I thought this was a fascinating topic, apparently not as popular as some of the more contemporary pop cultural topics, but I thought this guy was fascinating and worth mentioning. Anonymous throws in $5, no comment over on Streamlabs. Thank you very much, whoever you are, Anonymous, for sending that in. Really appreciate it. Ghost says, if I'm not mistaken, I think there was an old Russian movie about this guy. Don't know the name, just saw some meme clips of it. Oh, okay. Wasn't aware. I wouldn't be surprised if there already is one in Russian. And then Bat says, I wonder if him missing the war with Japan twisted him a bit and drove him to be crazier than he already was. Could be. I mean, when he went to the Russo-Japanese War, he was 19 years old. 19 years old, and all this dude wanted to do was get into the front lines of a battle. Okay. Stuart Little said there is a movie about him. It's Boar, and it's a 2006 Russian film. Oh, very cool. I have to check that. Let me pull that up. Boar, 2006 film. No, I don't think this one's about him, Stuart Little. Maybe I'm wrong, but I'm looking at it. I'm not seeing exactly what you're referring to. So if anybody's wanting to see, this is the movie that he mentioned. I don't think this is about von Ungern-Sternberg. Looks like a Australian horror film. Oh, it's tied with him. Yeah, I don't think he says, oh, that's not it. It's Boar in Russian. Oh, okay. All right. I'll check that out. Stuart Little. I'll have to figure out what the Russian is. And Jay Hamza throws in a generous $20. Thank you so much, Jay, for your support, brother. I really appreciate that. And he said, every topic is a great topic. It's all tied together. Yeah. History is a large narrative that gives you, I think of learning history. This is kind of the metaphor I use. It's like a bonfire, right? And so the circumference of visibility increases. The larger that fire gets, the more you know about history, the larger the circumference of visibility and knowability around the campfire emerges. That's why I think history is so important. And we really are a species with amnesia if we don't know history. And history comes with so many different lessons and intrigues and story narratives. So was he dueling with pistols or swords? I believe both, Austin Graham. I believe both. So if somebody wants to correct me, from my understanding, it's both. I know he was wounded in a duel from a gunshot, but I know that he did duels with swords as well. So I'm pretty sure it's both. But yeah, anyways, what I was saying to Jay about history, I think, you know, the more you learn, the more you can see around you. And even in the contemporary context, I mean, the more you learn about history, when you see the media hysteria over tariffs or trade, it's like you have a context to put everything in. And so I'd love to do some more. Okay, that's what Ghost said. So that's the name of the movie in Russian. That's about Roman von Ungern-Sternberg. So if you guys can type and write Russian, check that out. Walk in with the Spirit says, dual life ain't no joke. No, it is not a joke. It's not a joke. But hopefully this stream was interesting, insightful. My thoughts were it was a topic that most people haven't talked about. It kind of has a foot within our Orthodox paradigm, Orthodox worldview. It's an interesting piece of history, and in my mind is fairly contemporary. I mean, so being about 100 years old, it's still in a sort of modern period of history. So very interesting stuff. Crispy says, German aristocrats have facial scars from fencing duels. Oh, interesting. So, and Virginia Lou says, great stream. Thank you very much, Virginia. So guys, that's going to do it. Let me just double check, make sure I got everybody's super chats in. Thank you all very much for the support. And I will be back Thursday with another stream, and I hope to stream both Thursday and Friday. Not sure what the topic's going to be, but we're going to be doing some great streams as always. So thank you guys very much for being here. Thank you very much for all the support, and I will see you guys Thursday. Have a blessed Lent. Tomorrow night is pre-sanctified liturgy, so I hope if you guys are able to make it to get to your local parish, and I will see you guys Thursday. As always, until then, God bless.